Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with Zoe Chance, who teaches at the Yale School of Management. I guess you teach mainly marketing, but I understand that you also teach a course on kind of getting what you want or asking for anything, right? Which is now like a famous MOOC, which is, I guess, it's like marketing yourself as much as it is marketing a product. And also you're the author of this book called Influence Is Your Superpower, the science of winning hearts, sparking change, and making good things happen. Welcome, Zoe.
Thank you, Greg. It's great to get to meet you. And I don't actually feel like I teach marketing. I only teach influence. But as you said, it's not that different because when we're trying to share our ideas, it still uses lots of marketing principles. And marketing is my background in my previous life.
Yeah, you recounted a story at the beginning of the book about how, you're responsible for selling all sorts of stuff when you're with Mattel. And I'm gathering you're pretty good at it. But when it came to kind of getting your colleagues or your bosses to buy in, it represented something different, right? A little bit more challenging. And I guess one of the questions I have is, do we actually think of these different arenas of persuasion and influence as different, right? I mean, do we fail to leverage strengths that we may have developed in one area into another area? And one of the reasons why I ask is, I teach in a business school like you, and I have over the years come to realize that what we do at the business school is we try to create more effective people, right? I mean, we don't think of ourselves as, or at least I don't anymore, as think of myself as teaching finance or teaching statistics or teaching accounting. I think of myself as, how do I kind of help these people to be more effective, like to turbocharge the impact that they're going to have in the world. And yet the majority of what we teach has to do with finance and statistics and accounting and so forth. And so I think at the end of the day, when people look back, they probably would say that the stuff that they learned related to, persuasion and influence was the more important part of their business education. But, we only spend a relatively small part of our training on that topic. So, I mean, is that a mistake? I mean, if we were going to reboot the curriculum from scratch, would we want to spend more time on the topics that you deal with?
Oh my gosh, Greg, there's so many things that we should change if we're going to reboot from scratch. And I really believe that we will be rebooting from scratch essentially in the medium term future, which I find very exciting. And I know you're interested in do some work on AI, so I know you find it exciting as well. As far as what we spend our time on, I love that you're trying to help people be more effective. And I'm thinking of my 15-year-old daughter who's in high school, and so much of what she's studying just couldn't have less to do with being an effective human being. Starting with when she came into the school, they had to be learning Latin. Um, but I believe that many of us easily think of our jobs as being very siloed, right? And this is where your thinking in the podcast comes from, is let's get out of that. So when I was at Mattel, I was a brand manager for Barbie, and the Barbie sales were going well, like you said, but I thought that that was my job, and I defined my job so narrowly as consumer marketing toys to girls and their parents. And I didn't see my job as helping other people and our ideas to be more effective across our team and in the organization. And I really sucked at influence. And that's how I got interested in it because I sucked at influencing, especially my bosses and colleagues that I didn't have any sort of responsibility for. I think I was mediocre with my team. They had more experience than I did, as many MBA students find out when they graduated, like I did. You go into a management job, but then you're managing actual professionals who really know what they're doing, and you kind of have no idea what you're doing. You're figuring it out on the fly. But what I've realized between then and many, many, many years later now is that influencing other people, for most people in most jobs, is a huge part of our job. And it's definitely a bigger and bigger part of our job as we rise in an organization and levels of increasing responsibility. And I used to think that if you're the boss, you just get to tell people what to do and they're going to do
That's
it.
becoming much less
No,
effective.
totally not like that. Becoming less, but I think actually it has probably always been not that effective. There's this quote that I read by US President Harry Truman when he took office in, I think it was in 1945. And he says, I sit around here all day trying to persuade the people to do the things that they ought to know without me should be done. And that's all the powers of the president amount to. And here's this guy who, in that time, was arguably the leader of the free world. And he's complaining and whining that he has to spend his time influencing people. So, me as a little junior brand manager working on Barbie, I'm complaining to myself that I have to spend my time influencing people. But if that's actually the job of the US president, it's kind of the job of all of us. And like you said, we don't get trained. Can I ask you, Greg, because you clearly know how to do this, and influencing our students is a big part of our job, but with colleagues too, and academic politics and all that. How did you learn about interpersonal influence?
Gosh, I have to say that I'm still learning, right? Because look, I think academics and lawyers and economists and maybe even engineers, I think we tend to overestimate the capacity to persuade through evidence and logic and argument, right? Through logos, right? And now maybe it's because it does work, right? It's more likely to work in the places where we spend most of our time, right? I mean, if you're at a law firm, yeah, a good argument gets you places, and if you're at the academic seminar, I mean, yeah, good argument supported by data does kind of get you places. But then the minute you turn to your colleague, even if it's the same colleague, right, and you exit the seminar room and you're trying to persuade them to make a budget allocation, like all of those techniques which worked really well in the seminar room, like they don't work anymore. And so I think probably those of us who are in academia, we are probably the worst offenders because we fail to understand, right, the limited capacity to avoid the gator brain of the person that we're dealing with.
Yeah, you're absolutely right about these particular environments, law, academy, engineering, where we fancy ourselves to be particularly rational beings. But even in those environments, I guess I would push back a little bit. Even in those environments, the gator brain and this unconscious, intuitive, automatic, powerful gut system of gut reactions drives so many decisions. We just like to think that it doesn't. And in just a very simple, concrete way, thinking about in an environment of, say, law firm or academic seminar, the person and people who speak first have so much more influence
Mm-hmm.
than people who speak later. And that has nothing to do with their logical argument. It's also whoever has more power in the room, right? It doesn't matter if some junior person walks in, or say PhD student in the seminar has something great to say, and people don't pay as much attention to that person as they do to the fancy pants person who's there and respected by everybody. So I would say rational arguments carry a lot less weight in most contexts than people think that they do. But we do care some, right? It doesn't count none. We care
Right.
some.
Well, you were involved in the Google Food Project, and I used to teach a course on the workplace, and one of the examples that I would use in class, and we would go to visit Google campus, right? And we would see this in action. One of the examples I use is the frosted glass in front of the sugary beverages, which was part of the Google Food initiative to try and get people to be more healthy. And what's remarkable is how ineffective education seems to be, right? You explain to somebody, hey, this is good for you, this is bad for you, and then people like nod their head and they say, yeah, great, and then they grab for the soda. Um, why do you suppose that is? I mean, I guess let me put it another way. Should Sometimes we say we should meet people where they are, right? Like if it's your gator brain, let's just talk to the gator brain. But others would say, no, let's try to kind of elevate people to the place where these more rational arguments are more effective. And in the MBA program, we can kind of, you know, spend time trying to debias people, or we can sort of say, hey, that's kind of fruitless. Let's focus on this other thing, this other way of persuading. Which way's better? I mean, is there I mean, are there arguments in favor I mean, is there an ROI to try and, debias people, or should we just kind of give up on it and, meet people where they are?
Well, especially when we're talking about, I guess, bias in any context, but especially contexts where we have deep seated biases that many of us would like to get rid of, and they're influencing our social interactions, right? Um, all the research that I'm aware of supports the idea that we're really not going to take the bias out of people, but we can prevent bias from having a great influence on our behavior. And to me, this actually gives us reason for hope and allows us to say, okay, I have all of the biases that I have. And, over time they may fade, right? But this is things like massive culture shifts and revolutions where generationally we don't share the same prejudices that our parents and grandparents generations might have had. Our kids don't share ours. But if we focus on behavior, then it's much simpler, and then we're not blaming the people who have the biases. When you're talking about education and why doesn't education work so well, there are two really different factors here, and one is just, do we remember the stuff that we learned? And the answer is generally no. Right? Like, I don't know what you remember from high school. I remember really almost nothing from high school. And then when I think about college, what concrete things do I remember from college? Actually, it's still almost nothing. I remember some professors that I had in college. I remember having read particular books or read literature and theater and watched particular films, but concrete facts, zero. You may know about some work that John Lynch has done and others on the memory decay of financial literacy programs. And essentially, if you're teaching somebody something and they don't use it in about 48 hours, don't expect them to remember it later on. And we're doing things like teaching financial literacy in high school and then expecting somebody to remember those things a decade later. And that's absurd, right? So there's that piece, but then there's also willpower and intentions. And you want to talk about snacks and sugary beverages and things like that. You can remember that Coke is not good for me, but then you're having this argument and fight with your gator brain that is just asking you to have this wonderful, tasty thing right now. So education fails for at least two perfectly good reasons. What reasons would you add to the reasons that education fails us so miserably?
Yeah, I mean, I as an educator like to think, well, it's just the fault of the educator, right? And so,
That's
vow to improve. But I agree that the pure attempt to persuade at the cognitive level, ultimately is going to be pretty difficult. Now, look, I wouldn't. You're probably not going to appear in your college catalog anytime soon, right? Given what you just said about your experience, but I think one of the things that you point to in the book, and I think this is in your course as well, is that in order to kind of get good at persuasion, this is sort of something that requires practice, right? This is something that is a skill, right? And the way to learn something is to do something. And so you're very proactive in terms of getting your students to do these exercises, right? And one of the exercises was to get in the habit of saying no. And I think you're implying that people kind of default to yes, and so but getting in the habit of saying no all the time, then you feel okay when somebody says no to you. Now, when I read that, I was worried. Oh man, I'm never going to get her on the podcast, right? But luckily, you did say yes. So, this idea of saying no, you call it sort of what is it, a stress immune system, and I've heard similar things from other people who have been in sales, like getting comfortable with this idea of no. So, could you talk more about that?
Yeah, it's probably not a coincidence that I do have some experience in sales. I wish everybody would get experience in sales. I wish it was a requirement because you get put through the gauntlet of hearing no, 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 and you have to survive and develop a thick skin. And that's what actually helps you get more comfortable asking and become a better asker. So, the weird thing about saying no, you don't have to say it all the time to everybody or as a default response, but the default should be at least for you to question, do I really want to do this thing or is this really right for me rather than just defaulting to yes. So I do ask people to question that and to maybe start with 24 hours of no. The the magic of no is that when we're more comfortable saying no to other people, we're more comfortable with them saying no to us. And that means that our requests lose this edge of neediness that can be repulsive. So practice saying no leads indirectly to other people wanting to say yes to you.
Right. So, I think there's a subset of your readership who is, inclined to believe that saying yes to other people and being a giver is a good thing, and asking things of other people, right, and being a taker is, is a bad thing. And I think part of what you're trying to do is to get them to kind of overcome that presumption.
Yeah, I would absolutely question assumptions like that. And also, when we're asking for things, it could be something that would be helpful for you. It could be something that would be helpful for other people. It can also be invitations, right? Um, and when we're saying no, the big misconception there is that other people are not going to like us and it's going to hurt the relationship. And it really matters a lot how you say no, and you can do it with warmth and say no to the idea or the offer, but not to the relationship. You can still say yes to the relationship. And it helps sometimes to hear it verbally. But for example, if, say, I invited you to write a book with me and let's work on this next project together, and I'm all excited. And to me, it's scary to ask you. And you don't want me to take it personally when you say no, but you could literally tell me, like, oh my God, Zoe, that would be my worst nightmare. That sounds absolutely, absolutely horrible. But the way that I hear your tone of voice isn't that you would never want to do anything with me. It's just for whatever reason, like, this idea was her, like, oh, okay, well, what if we make cupcakes? Does that sound like fun? Like, yes, okay, great. Um, there are lots of misunderstandings about no. And another big one is that most people think they say no more often than they do, and they don't
Mm.
realize how much of a people pleaser they are. This is even people who think they're people pleasers, still don't realize how easily we default to yes. And when we're talking about being generous and like I work with lots of MBA students and leaders in organizations, nonprofits, corporations who are just really nice people, right? Just really great people who enjoy being helpful to others and enjoy having good relationships and making friends. So we don't want to be assholes. We don't want to be hated. We don't want to be seen as greedy. We want to be seen as helpful and kind and fun and all those good things. But when we just default to yes, besides that it just leaves us without any bandwidth to do all kinds of things that are important, we're also missing this opportunity to negotiate something even better. So, part of the questioning, is this something that's really right? Or how could it be even better for me or for them? Um, is a really important stage. And if you're just ordering from the menu of options that life gives you, you miss so many opportunities for all kinds of things that could be even better, not just for you, but for them.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are, um, they are afraid to speak up. I mean, I recounted this story in my class recently about how I was, in an Uber. I take an Uber down to Stanford a couple days a week, and when I get in the Uber, typically I'm working, right? And I got in this Uber, and they were playing talk radio, and so I couldn't really focus, and I started to sit there and start to stew and started to get all upset and started thinking this guy's a jerk and thinking I'm going to complain to Uber, and then I said, you know what, I'm just going to ask the guy, and I said, hey, would you mind turning it down? The guy's like, sure, no problem, right? Like, the assumption is that if it's something I want, it's got to be something that he doesn't want. And, what he wants to do potentially is to please me, right? And to, create a good ride. And maybe he doesn't care about the radio. Maybe he put the radio on because he thought that I wanted it. And so I tell this to my students because, I found that students are oftentimes, reluctant to speak up, right? When they perceive something that is potentially problematic or difficult. Maybe they'll ask for a grade revision, right? But they won't say, hey, could you maybe, give us more of this or less of that and so forth. So is that something that, I mean, it's not something that I normally would associate with MBAs, but I've noticed it recently. I mean, the MBAs that I knew back when I was in school, heck, they would, they would never hesitate to ask for something. Are people just getting, quote, nicer or more timid? Is there a trend in that direction? Is that partially because people, are used to asking for things through text and they're not, they don't know whether that's appropriate?
It's interesting that you perceive a trend toward being nicer or more timid, um, because I've heard other colleagues complain about the opposite. And maybe this is the grade changing kind of thing that you're suggesting, but um, there's
Well, I'm not saying they're timid behind my back, but they're not, but in terms of like just going up, looking me in the eye and saying, hey, this is what I think or want, right? That's the thing that I don't see people doing as much of.
so it's interesting that you don't. Um, I don't see any less of it. And I hear, especially when I'm teaching in exec ed programs, increasing complaints about how demanding
Mm,
whatever generation we're talking about might be, if it's like Gen Y or Gen Z or whatever, and a perception that some younger people at work are expecting to be just coddled with kid gloves, like a snowflakey kind of thing, where they really are asking for a lot. I would say my experience at school is a combination. I think that there's some people who are much more comfortable asking than other people, and it really depends on the context and power dynamics and things like this. One difference that I've seen, Greg, is that I've noticed people who complain about social justice related issues in my class. And I get complaints about it every year, and we talk about these kinds of issues. And I'm somebody who really cares passionately about inclusion and belonging and equity and social justice and all that. But I also am a human being who makes mistakes.
mm,
And the people who call me on it will very, very often, maybe the majority of time by now, be not someone who's from that group, being
mm,
marginalized from a marginalized group or being marginalized by me. It's people who observe that happening and they're standing up as allies. And
mm.
even though it's hard and there are a lot of complaints that happen, not just me, but colleagues, like there's a lot of students going to the dean to complain about things that happen in classrooms, but there's really a lot of allyship. And so
Yeah, but I
I,
think they're going to the dean. They're not going to you and saying, hey,
it's both.
like let's talk about this.
My
Yeah.
experience is both. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Well, the other thing is,
Um,
you talk about charisma, right? And you say it's not something that you are, it's something you do. Now, if it's something you do, then it's something you can teach, right?
Well, a lot of people are terrible at teaching the things that they're good at.
Well, I'm not
But
saying you have to be good at it to
you
teach it, but what I'm
can be
saying is that you can teach people
good, can be
to
taught.
do charisma, right?
Yeah, yeah. And it's very, very, very cool to watch a transformation that happens. And this can be done even in a 10-minute coaching demo in a workshop where you have somebody who doesn't like public speaking very much come up and start speaking, practicing a story. And then I do a little intervention and they get to practice it. And I'm helping them, the audience and the person up there gets to experience the night and day difference between an uncomfortable person standing there and trying to do a good job and someone who's really connecting with the audience. And charisma is all about connection. And for any educators or team leaders listening right now, I'll just, if it's okay with you, Greg, I'll just explain super quick the demo that can be
Yeah.
done at work. All it is that you have everyone in the audience raise their hand and keep it raised. So it'll be a few minutes. So you put your elbow on the table and they don't put their hand down until they feel that the speaker connected with them. And so visually, the speaker gets to experience what happens, how long it takes to connect with somebody. The speaker's job is only, you can only talk to one person at a time, and you make eye contact with that person and you keep talking to them until their hand goes down. This is the entire demonstration. And in a room of, say, 30 people or so, in 5 minutes, an unskilled speaker can typically connect with everyone in that room. In the audience, also, you put your hand down if you felt a vicarious connection. So maybe Greg was the person that the speaker was connecting with and making eye contact with, but I felt it. So my hand goes down. And it's really making the connection and holding it. And if it's difficult, and say, I'm looking at you, making eye contact, and I'm talking, and your hand isn't going down, what I can do is pause. A lot of times the connection is made in the pauses and I can approach. And as I walk forward toward you, you cannot help but feel the connection as long as I'm not breaking that. So I write in the chapter on charisma about a bunch of different things, but this is just a super fun, concrete demo for anyone who wants to play with it.
And you call that shining, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
By the way,
I guess
Greg,
it's,
thank you so much for the really exceptionally diligent preparation that you did for this conversation. And I can't imagine how much work and effort it takes for you to have all of these conversations with all of these different interesting people that you bring on. And I don't, I hope that your listeners don't take it for granted. As someone who has had a lot of conversations on a lot of different podcasts, there's a very wide range, and you're on the really generous end of that spectrum. So thank you.
wow, I think you're trying to influence me here. Right. So, well, look, I mean, I'd read the book no matter what, because this is something which I've struggled with this, with my students. Um, I teach a class where I do a lot of cold calling, right? I teach a course on strategy, and I expect everybody to, make arguments and, get into discussion mode and, ultimately do presentations. And, what I've heard from a lot of students is, hey, look, I'm an introvert, so, you know, I'm not good at this. And, but, isn't kind of business school meant to be transformative, right? Like, hey, before I went to start taking business school classes, I was an introvert. I think when I take the tests, I took Susan Cain's test and at one of her events, and I was introvert, but after a couple business school classes, I sort of say, hey, well, I can do this stuff, right? And I mean, does it just require kind of like a change mindset to appreciate the fact that it's not who you are, it's what you do? I mean, obviously it's gonna be harder for some people than others, but that's not a reason not to do it.
Greg, I'm really passionate about this concept that I call behavioral introversion. And this is not something that I wrote about in the book. But I love that you're bringing it up. And there is the what we do and the who we are piece of introversion and extroversion. So the behavior and the trait. And we're probably not going to do anything about our traits, at least not in the short run. And we have a bit of control over our behavior. And then as teachers or leaders in environments where we have a wide range of introverts and extroverts, we may not be thinking about how there are people who are extroverted in some contexts that show up as introverts in the domain in which we see them. And this is really just a matter of, are you behaving like someone who thinks before they speak? That's an introvert. Are you behaving like someone who thinks while they speak? And that's an extrovert. So, in situations where you are low power relative to other people, or say you're speaking in your non-native language that you're not totally fluent in, or you just feel like a little bit of an outsider compared to this group, you have a gatekeeper and you're thinking about what you say before you say it. So it takes you longer to contribute your ideas to the conversation, and you contribute fewer of them. You have less influence in this room, but it's not just fewer, it's because you didn't speak up as soon as other people did.
Yeah.
And those early ideas influence the whole flow of the conversation. So I believe as a teacher or a leader, we really need to be learning how to bring out introverts' great ideas and how to bring those behavioral introverts into the conversation earlier.
And so for those folks, maybe you give them a pause, right? So, you don't expect them to be like the person on Jeopardy that's going to, hit the buzzer, right? So, you call on them and maybe give them a little more time to, gather their thoughts than, someone who's chomping at the bit to, spit out, right, what's flowing through their head. Is that a technique you can use to kind of coax things out of people?
You can give them pauses, yes, in all different ways. So you can, and maybe it's not a pause, but giving them time. So before a meeting, you send out the agenda and maybe you warm call them. And I say, Greg, I would love to hear your thoughts on such and such topic when you show up in the room so that you know and you're prepared. I would always let people practice brainstorming on their own before asking in a brainstorm group for people to share creative ideas. Um, you can have people write, like especially as teachers, we have people sometimes write their reflections before they then speak in the group. Or in teaching, sometimes we'll do a pair share so that you got to share with just one other person before you then share in the group. There lots of different ways to do it. Cold calling is a scary way, like just cold call and then silence. I think, Greg, you and I probably both don't recommend for people, as it's just not a great way to build rapport, have people feel comfortable. And as people get more comfortable, they'll do more sharing. Um, we can just be noticing who's speaking a lot in the room and work on skillfully shutting those people down as well.
Mm.
So at the same time as bringing out introverts' great ideas, we need to learn how to take the spotlight off of people who are behaving consistently like extroverts and taking all the airtime.
Yeah, one of the things I do in my class is I give the students the option of, asking their analyst, right? So every student can, when they're asked a question, they can say, well, my analyst actually has, a lot more to say on this than I do, or, my analyst has done a deep dive into this. But the point
Do
is
they
that,
cold call someone else in that case then?
well, they do, but I tell them, like, know who your analyst is before you show up for class, rather than fishing around for somebody,
Oh,
right? Because
okay.
in the real world, you will always have people will have your back, right? And you can't be afraid to ask them, like, hey, will you have my back, right? If I go to class and I get cold called, are you there to support me and help me? And I've noticed that sometimes students are reluctant to ask each other for help, but that's kind of part of what we're training them to do, is to create this network of support, of people that they can count on, right? That they can offer assistance to and get assistance from, and not have them feel like they have to do everything on their own, right? I mean, that's, to me, that's like one of the most important lessons of business school, is learning how to delegate, and how to, offload, and and to kind of lean on people, and rely on people and trust people.
I love that you're teaching that in a finance class. And for listeners thinking about doing more delegating, asking, offloading, getting help, 100% yes. And keep in mind that consistently research shows that women get asked more for help. They get asked more often by more people. They do say yes more often because of cultural norms about being helpful and nurturing. So it's not surprising that we easily jump to asking women for help. And I encourage my students, when you're practicing asking for more help, just have a debiasing little voice in your head that says, should I ask a guy? It's not that you always have to ask a guy, but just have the voice in your head that says, should I ask a guy for help, so that
Mhm.
we don't have this uneven distribution of labor that got offloaded. I don't know that that would happen overly much with women in your class teaching finance and asking for, will you be my analyst? But it might. I don't know.
Yeah, and I was wondering, I mean, if women get asked more, um, and say yes more, uh, are their no's better received, or worse received? Because I get the sense that you know when a woman says no, it's that they can probably do a better job of letting people down easy, right? And so that so it'd be ironic if they're you know it's easier to say no, and they say no less often, right? So would it be about kind of emphasizing this training of hey, saying no is not always received in a negative way?
Well, what sucks, Greg, is that women have more pressure to do it well.
Mm.
So, women, many women through practice have learned to be more graceful saying no. However, a man and a woman saying no in a similar straightforward way, like, oh no, sorry, I can't,
Right.
can come off sounding really different when the woman says it. And sometimes we have backlash against women for just being asking or saying no in a perfectly straightforward, direct way that a man could, quote unquote, get away with, which everybody should be able to just speak to each other like normal people. But the it's very simple, and women have to be warm if they don't want other people to get upset. It's not in every situation, but women have to be willing to be warm, and men do better with people being warm. So still, we all should. We should all treat each other, with warmth and empathy in almost all situations, especially work. But women face high consequences relative to men from not doing that.
So it's more difficult to project both warmth and strength, right? If you're a woman.
I don't know. it is difficult for a lot of people because it's not. These are two things that we don't think of as going together.
Mhm.
And we just don't have a whole lot of role models who do both of these things simultaneously.
Now, in addition to teaching people how to persuade, I always think that you also have to spend time teaching people how to be persuaded, and how to not be persuaded. And there's a whole section in the book on, right, red flags, right, where people who are trying to persuade you, in a not in a pie growing way, but in a win lose way. And
In a
sometimes
manipulative way.
it's difficult to tell, right? Sometimes when someone's trying to persuade you, whether it's a pie growing, or not. And when you do this shine thing, I mean, does there have to be genuine empathy? I mean, does the speaker have to genuinely care? I mean, or is it easy to fake?
Um, Empathy isn't easy for people to fake, but a lot of people who are very, very successful in some fields related to persuasion have gotten good at faking it, or they succeed because they're good at faking it, right? And con artists, for example, are great at building relationships and faking um, emotional dynamics and things like that. Maybe they're sociopaths. We are terrible at lie detection. We think that we can spot fakes and people who are lying to us, but that's only because what we can spot is discomfort, and we associate discomfort with lying. So if you can't keep eye contact with me, and you keep looking away and clearing your throat and things, I see these signs, and let's say that I know you and we're in a close personal relationship where that is not normally how you communicate with me. There's something going on that you're uncomfortable about. It's likely that I'm much worse at knowing when you're lying than I think that I am. And when it's with strangers, again, I'm much worse. But the bad part is that when we're talking about someone like a sociopath who is a very skilled liar and faker of these kinds of emotions, they're not uncomfortable. And so nobody can tell because you're staring directly into my eyes and you are just telling me bullshit after bullshit, whopper lie. But you seem so sincere to me because you're not uncomfortable at all. And I would never know. So we need to look for other signs.
Right. So there's going to be a disproportionate number of those types of people in positions of power, right?
Yeah. Um, yes, depending on what it is in that situation that gets someone into a position of power. But many cases, yes, like, politicians are famous for doing a lot of lying a lot of the time,
Mm-hmm.
right? Supposedly, CEOs score very high on psychopath tests, going along with
Yeah.
narcissism.
Now you also talk about kind of the use of diminishing language, right? So if you're lower in status, you're more likely to use this diminishing language, and this makes you less effective, right, as a persuader. So it's kind of puzzling, right? So is it that you people do this because they want to make it clear that they recognize the high status of the other person and that they don't, you know, represent a threat, and that's why they do it, even though it's going to be less effective at helping them to pursue their goals.
People think that diminishing language, which is things like, I thought, I was just wondering, I could be wrong, but so this is probably ridiculous. It's lots of little preambles that we put in our sentences that garble up our delivery, where essentially we are saying, I'm not a threat, and that part is successful. We don't come off as a threat, but that's not the intention. The intention is, I want you to like me. And that's where we fail. Because, okay, fine, I'm not a threat to you, but you don't actually like me. And so I haven't been effective in my communication with you or persuasive because you're just kind of tuning me out as this little gnat buzzing around in the atmosphere somewhere, hard to even listen to the words that I'm saying. And what was going on in this buzzing around gnat like unthreatening thing is that all of my attention was on myself and how you would think about me. And where you'll feel a radical shift is if I can put my attention on you. And a really simple way to shift diminishing language is to practice, when you can, asking a question. So let's say I'm going to share a crackpot idea. I could say, this might sound really silly, or maybe you're not going to like this, but the little bzzz. Or I could just say, okay, Greg, tell me what you think of this totally freaking insane idea. And then your
Right.
attention is boom, right here. Right. And it's exciting. And I haven't diminished whatever it is I'm about to share with you. And it can be totally crackpot, and that's completely fine. You haven't diminished your perception of me as a human being. We're just creatively brainstorming.
Yeah, I mean that's why we tell people, our founders, when they meet a VC, right? If you want money, ask for advice, right? And it's remarkable how people with crackpot early stage ideas, they haven't even gotten their first check. If they walk up to a VC at a meetup or something and say, hey, I just love your input on this idea. Like they'll do it. I have friends who are, senior VC folks, and somebody will just grab them on the on the side of the road and say, hey, what do you think of this? And those will lead to relationships, and they'll lead to investments, and they'll lead to advisory positions. It's really remarkable how effective that is.
Yeah, and everyone pitching to VCs should know about this research that's been done on Hollywood movie pitches, and the most successful showrunners distinguish themselves from everyone else by involving the studio producers in the creative process and doing exactly what you're talking about, asking their advice. So, not saying, here's this perfect thing, now go fund it, but here's a seed of an idea. And what do you think about this? And how about that? And what if? And it's so exciting to be part of the generation of this wonderful thing that then you're in it already, right? It
Mhm.
already is your thing. We already are a team. So
Right.
I'm
And
so
so
glad
part
you're
of it,
teaching that.
yeah, but it does require some level of confidence, right? Like, we like to make fun of MBAs when we say always confident, sometimes right. That's one of the jokes that I like to say, but that's not a vice. I mean, that's a virtue, right? This comfort with one's self. I mean, as long as it doesn't filter into overconfidence. I mean, having a certain baseline confidence makes other people want to say yes to you, right? And that's what you say is the key thing, right? You want to get people to want to say yes to you.
Absolutely. That's the whole purpose of everything I teach is helping other people want to say yes to you.
Mhm.
And you don't want other people to see you as arrogant, but you're saying you need to be confident to seek advice. And what I hear is also you need to be humble to seek advice. So you need to be confident enough to approach that person and humble enough to be actually really sincerely seeking their advice, not using this as a tactic to like, oh, I asked somebody's advice and now I'm going to ask them a favor. Like if you didn't do anything with that advice, they're not excited to do you the favor,
Mhm.
right? It's this dynamic that you created that's a real relationship where you're really being receptive and listening and trying to get help from them and following up and doing the thing. And then you come back to them over time and you say, thank you so much. And here's what happened when I tried to follow your advice. And this totally failed, but this totally succeeded. And what do you think now?
Yeah, I mean that's how I've made my angel investments, right? It's the people who come to me for advice,
Yeah.
and then they report back and they say, "Hey, I I tested out your advice," and then I'm like, "Oh, okay, this person it likes to listen, so here, I'll give them a check because that's what you're looking for in a founder is right the confidence to question their own ideas, the confidence to right run them under some kind of scrutiny. Now, getting back to warmth and strength, you have this image in the book of a kindly brontosaurus. Right? And I was thinking of, Barney. I mean, I don't know whether that was the image that you wanted me to come up with, but but this, I mean, it's hard. I mean, brontosauruses are warm and cuddly, but they're also huge and they can, do some damage. Um, how do
They're
you how do you make
vegetarian.
sense of this image?
So I love this image. It's not mine. There was a journalist, her name is Jessica Winter, who wrote this article in Slate about the kindly brontosaurus. I assigned it to my class. They loved it. And so I teach the kindly brontosaurus. I can't take credit for the term of art. The idea is that it is this impossible to ignore gentle herbivore that isn't aggressively trying to get what it wants, but it's persistently there in your sphere of vision. And if your attention wanders, it's right back there where all you're doing with a kindly brontosaurus is you ask for what you want. And then when you don't yet get that thing that you want, you wait, literally or figuratively, still in view. And an example that I share in the book is that really surprised me that this worked at all was a student who was so charming and wonderful and someone that you want to say yes to. And because this student is charming and wonderful, people want to say yes. When he asked in his job negotiation conversations, could I have a company car? They were like, well, let's see what we can do. Okay, you got it. We've never done it before. They said yes, but then they came back later and said, I'm so sorry. Actually, it's totally against our policy, and we can't give people at your level a company car. So that's taken off the table. So normal people just say, like, okay, well, thanks for trying. That's what I would do. However, he tried kindly brontosaurus and he said, oh, that's okay. I understand. I'll check back later and just see if it's possible. But I totally understand. I appreciate your efforts. So there, he's having conversations with them over the course of the rest of the semester. He tells me, he's like, I'm trying the kindly brontosaurus. I'm like, okay, well, I'm sure this is not going to go anywhere for you, but go ahead and try this technique. And he keeps coming back and just checking in and saying, like, I know you had already tried, but I'm just checking back to see, is it possible any movement on the company car front? And like, no, it's really not happening. And I think it was maybe the fourth time that he checks back and they're like, hey, guess what? We got it for you. And they figured out a way around the policy because he just very, very gently didn't let them forget that he's still there checking in. It's not this formal, persistent, repeated request that they are feeling pressured by. It's just like, hey, he's just this guy that we like, checking in to see if it might be possible. And they made it work. So many things that start out as impossible turn out to be possible. And that's a big piece of the magic of real world practice in a class like Influence, where you just can't imagine. And as a professor, so many of my students do things that I couldn't imagine them succeeding in. Um, but there is just so much graciousness, goodness, kindness, generosity, and unimagined possibilities that feel like they're raining down from the sky when you are approaching more people more often with this gentle, enthusiastic, kind, open-minded way of just saying, like, hey, is this possible? Might we do this thing together? And people try to look for ways to say yes to you.
Well, one of the techniques that you mentioned, which I've used with success, is what would it take, right? So, oftentimes when I'm dealing with administrators, and I say, hey, can we do this? No, can't do it. Why is that? And then they got to come up with a reason, like there's no budget or whatever. But if you say, okay, look, like what would have to happen in order for this thing to be feasible, right? Like what's the stumbling block, right? What's the obstacle? Um, and what's interesting there is that oftentimes when you pose that question, what would it take? They point to something that's very different from what they would point to if you asked them for a reason, right? Because oftentimes the reason is just sort of, they got a grab bag of reasons, kind of reach in and grab. Bernie Roth I interviewed, he said, he says, reasons are bullshit. People just make them up. But when you say, what would it take? I think people have to be a little bit more thoughtful and a little bit more honest, because what you're asking for is, tell me what your problem is, and I'll try to figure out how to solve it so that we can get this thing done.
What would it take? I call it the magic question because it is so powerful and it's so multi-purpose. You can use it almost anytime with almost anybody. And I'm really excited that you're using it. So thank you, Greg. And awesome. And keep going. The magic question shifts dynamics in a conversation where somebody who you were trying to influence, instead of feeling pressured, feels invited to be part of a collaborative problem solving process. It might not even be something you have to do to solve the problem. They may know, in many cases, all kinds of things that might be helpful that you didn't know, or obstacles that you didn't know about. They might take care of them. Um, a, a situation that happened in a company where I worked as an MBA student was that there's a senior leader, her name is Ginger Graham, who has to ask employees to come in and work overtime during a 6-month period on the production line between Thanksgiving and Christmas. And she's going to ask them to now work 3 shifts a day instead of 2 shifts. And this is a situation where normally we'd use incentives, right? And this is how lots of persuasion works in a work environment, that either there's going to be a carrot or there's going to be a stick or there's going to be both. Maybe you have to do this or you'll be fired. Maybe we need to do this and we're going to give you a bonus, right? But what she realized was that she didn't just want employees to come in and work overtime on production during this holiday period, but she wanted them to feel good about it. And she wanted them to feel that like they had some agency in this happening. And of course, they need to feel engaged after this crunch period is over. Like if you give people incentives that are big enough, you can influence their behavior, but you can make them feel like slaves because they weren't able to say no. And then as soon as that's done, at a job, they're going to look for the next job that pays them a little more money. So she asks these employees not what would it take for you to come in and work overtime for these 6 weeks, but she says, what would it take for you to feel good about coming in to work overtime during this holiday period? And they conference with each other and they come back to her and they say, okay, Ginger, here's what it would take. First of all, we take the bus and there's no bus that runs at night. So we need cab fare to get home. She's an executive. She doesn't know anything about the buses. So great. She didn't know. They said, we're hungry and we like pizza. Great. Happy to get them pizza. And that pizza is going to be much more enjoyable for them if it's pizza they asked for instead of just pizza that she randomly had ordered to the office. Why didn't she order filet mignon or whatever? And the third thing they said is, we're stressed about wrapping our Christmas presents. So if you could hire a Christmas present wrapper, that would mean the world to us. And this is such a small thing in a situation like this, but it means so much. This gesture of what would it take for you to feel good about it? And then I'm going to follow through and I'm going to give you the Christmas present wrapper that you asked for. And so production hits record levels and everybody gets a 30% bonus, which was huge. And so the incentives are still there. You don't not pay people to do more work than you ask them for, but they're excited to work there and they're loyal. And, if a competitor comes trying to recruit them, it's going to take more than just a little bit more money to get them to walk out the door.
Now, when you talked about what attracted you to behavioral economics, you said, well, on the one hand, it explores both mechanisms and behavior, but you also said something about how you were attracted to its implicit moral philosophy. Now, I don't know whether most behavioral economists think a lot about their implied moral philosophy. What do you take it to be?
I think they do. I hope they do, because we talk in behavioral economics a lot about libertarian paternalism. And many of my colleagues are libertarian. I'm not. But the ethos of libertarian paternalism is that we want to give people freedom to make their own choices, recognize and encourage and support their own agency. But the paternalism part is that we want to gently offer easy ways that they can make good choices, good decisions, take care of them. You mentioned some research I did with the Google Food team. The leader of the Google Food team called, instead of libertarian paternalism, this philosophy, maternalism. We're going to feed you food, make you comfortable, and we're going to help you be healthy, but in this way that has you feel this warmth and hospitality. So behavioral economics allows freedom of choice, and still it nudges or encourages people towards certain outcomes. And the reason that paternalism or maternalism works well with behavioral economics is that if people feel that you are nudging them in a direction that's consistent with their best interest, they tend to not mind the nudging and the influence that you were doing. If they feel that you were trying to manipulate them to do something in your best interest, but not theirs, then there can be tremendous backlash. So this maternalism, paternalism piece is important. And when somebody feels that you're trying to influence them to do something that they don't feel bad about the possibility of doing, and it's not you just being this selfish, manipulative person, it feels pretty good on both sides. So I like influence that feels good on both sides. So we don't mind doing it, and we don't mind being on the receiving or listening end.
Now, there was quite a bit of pushback, I think, at Google when they initially launched the, what is it, Meatless Mondays, right?
Right.
And I guess, Google has a lot of libertarians, right? So they, they were like, hey, I don't want this nanny company telling me what to eat, right?
That's right. And this is partly how I got invited to come in and help them have people less mad, because Meatless Monday to me it sounded fine. And, I've been vegetarian many years of my life. And I wasn't recognizing until they told me the story of what had happened that when you have this frame of meatless, it's focusing on you're taking something away. And it is also implying I'm taking this meat away from you because you are a bad person who hates animals and hates the environment. You're a murderer, right? So, Meatless Monday, perfectly innocent intent, where they were just feeding employees not even actually meatless meals because they still served fish at one out of their 24 cafes. But it was a pilot test only in September. Labor Day's a holiday, so it was 3 days of 365, one out of 24 cafes. And there was an outcry among a small but very visible group of Google employees, the Googlers, who hosted a pig roast in the parking lot of that cafe, invited everybody to come, and then went into that cafe for the plates, cups, napkins, and all of these things. So they never wanted to have that kind of outcry happening again if they could help it. And so in their food um, philosophy and food policy now, they try to offer people a range of choices. And it's not that you can't make, for example, unhealthy choices. It's just not as easy to make unhealthy choices as it might be to make healthy choices, like with the example that you shared about the frosted glass over the sugary drinks. It's just easy to see the waters and diet sodas. And so you're more likely to grab one of those things, but nobody's preventing you from grabbing a Red Bull or whatever they serve these days.
So, I mean, last question, which is also another one about moral philosophy. You know, in some ways, what you're describing is utilitarian in a way, right? Where, you're trying to maximize the pie, and you can do it in a Pareto improving way, right? Everybody's better off, right? It's pie, everyone gets a bigger slice. But there are some people who might take a more deontological approach to persuasion and say, there's good ways to persuade and bad ways to persuade, right? And the ends don't justify the means. And I sometimes find myself falling into this trap where, I don't want to be, if I'm doing a good job, I don't want to be fired because the boss doesn't like me. But if I'm doing a bad job, like I don't want to be promoted because the boss likes me, right? And and so I want to be promoted based on my the merits, and so if I feel like I'm being overly nice to the boss, then this sort of makes me feel you know somewhat tainted and somewhat dirty, because then I don't know, like, if I do get promoted, is it just because the boss likes me, right? And and how do you address that? I mean, is there a place for that in the philosophy of persuasion?
To get really specific and concrete about that relationship with your boss, first of all, the relationship with your boss is the number one factor determining how long you stay at that organization and how engaged you are in your job. So, it even if you never wanted to be promoted, it should be a huge priority for you to have a good relationship with your boss. And in order for your boss to like you probably need to like your boss. So your job is actually to figure out how to like your boss more than your job is to have your boss like you. When you figure out how to like your boss will like you. It will happen, and you will be sincere, and you don't have to feel like you're some faker just trying to be liked and likable so that you can get promoted. And it just is true that people get promoted because we like them. We're never going to get away from it. And they get not promoted because we don't like them. But if you're listening to this and you just saw some jerk get promoted when you should have gotten promoted, or you just got promoted and now you're worried, what if you're not competent? It's just that when we like people, we look for reasons to support the choices that we want to make. Like, I would like to work with that person on my team or promote them or help them get the raise they asked for. And this is motivated reasoning and happens in all kinds of domains. And it's also when we don't like somebody, we look for reasons to not deal with them any more than we absolutely have to. And Tiziana Kashara Rotman has some work on who gets promoted and who doesn't in organizations. And she has a really nice short HBR article for anyone interested that's called Lovable Fools and Competent Jerks. And the TLDR is that all of us want to promote lovable, competent people. However, the people who get promoted between the lovable fools or the competent jerks are always the lovable fools, even though we think what we care about is competence.
Right. So, in other words, you should feel bad because if you don't try to promote that, then you're potentially depriving your organization and your boss and your colleagues of some value that you can add.
And
So,
the biggest thing is that you will be unhappy in your job if you have a bad relationship with your boss. And most
right.
bosses are bad bosses. They haven't been trained to be good bosses. When Gallup did some research, their statistics, according to their definition of good bosses, led to 90% of managers being categorized as bad bosses. So I coach all of my students that you always have to manage your relationship with your boss and don't expect them to be managing you because they're just probably not good at it.
That's some pretty good advice, deep wisdom. So everybody check out this book. Influence is your superpower. And if you have a chance, check out the MOOC, which is available. Where is the MOOC? Where do we find that?
The
Is that
MOOC
on
is
Coursera?
actually still in production. So thank you for the encouragement to finish the MOOC. It will be on Coursera. And anyone who does get the book, it's available in 28 languages, all different formats. And however you get it, it's contributing to help solve the climate crisis. I'm donating 50% of my profits to 350.org and other green organizations who are working on influencing the biggest problem that we have. So I totally believe in being influenced as we try to influence. And this is how I've been influenced by my students to actually take action on this climate issue.
Well, thanks for joining me, Zoe. We'll
Thank
talk again.
Appreciate it, Greg.
Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.